Hello and welcome back to, I believe, the first proper top 10 I've ever done. I'll be counting down the list of my 10 favorite albums of the far away and distant year of 2011. And as far as why I'm doing this, well, it's pretty simple. 2011 was the year I started this channel. You know, even if I didn't upload anything on it for another 3 years, it was the year I started this channel. And it was also the year that my musical consciousness in the form that it currently exists in kind of began. You know, I listened to music in the 2000s, I listened to a lot of music in the 2000s, but I didn't really put any thought into it. I was an extremely passive music listener in the 2000s. I listened to what was on the radio, I listened to what my parents played, and I listened to some of what I had, but I was not a sophisticated music listener, and I did not really actively go out and look for music. And 2011 was the year that changed, and I started looking at music critically, and I started thinking about music critically, and I started really starting to think, I could do music criticism. I could do amateur music criticism. And yeah, so that's why I'm doing this list. Most of what's on this list I actually didn't hear at the time because I was lame 8 years ago, and I was a moron, and I did not start actively listening to new music again until 2015. There was a 4 to 5 year period in the 2010s where I was the pretentious guy who was new music sucks. I don't listen to new music. That was a horrible mistake on my part, and those of you who may be like that right now, stop it. Stop it immediately. But yeah, anyway. Now as far as where it stands in the sort of the progression of pop music and popular music in the 2010s, 2011 is an interesting year, not because it's a year where anything changed, but in some ways for the opposite. It's not a year like 2010 where there were a lot of fantastic blockbuster releases from contemporary artists. It's not 2013 where it's a big transition year where a lot of different things happened and a lot of stuff went down. No, it's just a decent, solid year that is, you could argue is kind of inessential, but I wouldn't. There were a lot of older artists who came back to put out albums in 2011, and that's very much reflected on my list. Fun fact about when I make these lists, every time I'm like, oh, John, this is too close to Pitchfork's year-end list. You're treading in dangerous waters. And then I actually go back and I read Pitchfork's year-end list for any given year, and I'm blown away because every time, easily 75% of Pitchfork's year-end lists from the first half of this decade, it's all no-name indie bands who released albums that I don't think anybody's listened to since that particular year. Anyway, we're getting off topic. Here's the list. This is my opinion. If you think I've left the finest album of the year off the list, leave it in the comments down below. I'm always open to hear new music, and even if I think you're wrong. But anyway, here's the list. So number 10 is Radiohead's The King of Limbs. Yeah, I know. This is the Radiohead album you're supposed to hate. This is the one that finally broke the spell and got all the Pitchfork core hip kids to realize that Radiohead really hadn't done very much new or interesting since Amnesiac. But you know what? I kind of like this album, maybe because of that. It feels so unpretentious, which, if you are at all familiar with Radiohead's body of work, is really saying something. The album has such a sleepy, dreamlike quality to it that, for whatever reason, I really like. There are no real major standouts besides maybe the first track, Bloom, but on the whole, I think it's a decent little album, even if, like I said, it doesn't do all that much different from any other. It's not a great album, but it's my go-to Radiohead album if I want to listen to something completely inoffensive while I'm just kind of laying about. So my number 9 is Jay-Z and Kanye West's collaborative album, Watch the Throne.
I missed this one at the time, but going back to it, it's pretty good. Jay-Z and Kanye aren't necessarily at the top of their lyrical game here, but the production is as top-notch as you'd imagine from Kanye at his early 2010s peak. And the album features a star-studded cast of guest stars such as Frank Ocean, Beyoncé, and even a posthumous appearance from the late great Otis Redding. All in all, Watch the Throne is one of those star-studded collaborative albums that, while never quite living up to its potential, nevertheless manages to be a deeply enjoyable listen, even if it's definitely lost some of its shine now that Kanye and Jay-Z aren't on good terms anymore. So number 8 is Green Naugahyde by Primus. After a 12-year gap between studio albums, and a period of intermittent touring during the late 2000s, Primus finally returned in 2011 with Green Naugahyde. Probably one of their better albums in my opinion. Drummer Tim Herb Alexander left again, but they picked up Jay Lane to replace him, and he's a pretty good fit, especially considering how he was the original Primus drummer long before they recorded their very first album. Musically, Green Naugahyde finds Primus striking a happy balance between the more prog-inflected sound of their mid-90s work and the hard-edged funk of their earlier albums, while lyrically the album is more or less the debut of the sort of acidic social commentary that has characterized Les Claypool's post-2011 works. And I gotta say, the social commentary on here is kind of a mixed bag. You know, you have extremely dated commentary on then contemporary issues like Jersey Shore and such like, mixed in there with issues that have actually arguably gotten worse since this album was released, like Jilly's on Smack, a commentary on the opioid epidemic. Green Naugahyde is a very good album, and out of the bottom half of this list, it's probably the one I've listened to the most over the years, but I do have to note that, you know, if you're just getting into Primus, you should probably hear all of their 90s stuff before you get to this point, and ultimately, that's the reason I couldn't put it higher on this list. It's good, but in the context of their broader career, kinda inessential. So number 7 is Section 80 by Kendrick Lamar.
Kendrick Lamar's Section 80 strikes me as a very good album that time has not been especially kind to. Don't get me wrong, this is one of the better albums of 2011. It absolutely deserves its place on this list, and if I had been making this in 2011, I probably would have put it higher. If only because it's an album that shows a lot of promise. It's an album that shows a lot of talent. It's a very ambitious album that has kind of a loose song cycle about some lesbians living in Section 80 housing and their trials and tribulations of their lives. Or at least I think that's what it's about. And yeah, when I said that time hasn't been super kind to that, I was mostly talking about the fact that Kendrick put out 2 masterpieces and one kind of normal album that I think are all better than this. You know, he goes for that Voice of Black America thing that he goes for on Good Kid, Mad City and To Pimp a Butterfly, and it doesn't quite come off here. He's a little too green. He's not quite there yet. You know, he's got the ambition on this album, but he's not quite there yet. And I think a lot of it is probably the production. This sounds like a 2011 album, and it sounds like a hip-hop debut from 2011, and I guess it's just jarring to hear Kendrick, you know, in such an almost undeveloped form. And, you know, it's a really good album, but I think that maybe if you come to it from his later work the way I did, it can be a little underwhelming. But anyway, very good album. Moving on.
So number 6 is Kate Bush, 50 Words for Snow. 50 Words for Snow was Kate Bush's first album in 6 years and her last to date. And it's a fantastic record, a concept album about winter that perfectly encapsulates the feeling of looking out the window on a snow day and watching those beautiful snowflakes drift down from the heavens. In keeping with the concept, the album is much more minimalist musically than any of Kate's previous records. On about half of these songs, the only accompaniment to her beautiful voice is a piano and maybe a little bit of bass. However, the album is not without its stranger moments, as you would expect. There are songs about the Yeti, frozen corpses preserved beneath the surface of Lake Tahoe, and even in the album's most bizarre moment, the 13 minutes Misty, a song about having sex with a snowman. All in all, 50 Words for Snow is one of several fantastic albums by older artists that were released in 2011, and the only reason it's not higher on the list than it is that every song on here is a little longer than it should be. It almost feels as though Kate were making up for the fact that her single 90s album was a fairly reasonable length by having every song on here be over the 6-minute mark, and as a result it can kind of drag. Also, it's not really an album I want to listen to outside of winter, but when it is winter, it's a phenomenal record. Next up, number 5 is Tom Waits' Bad As Me. Just like Kate Bush on 50 Words for Snow, Tom Waits' Bad As Me is, to date, his final album, and I hope it doesn't actually turn out being his last record, but if it does, it'll be a pretty good note to go out on, because this album is fantastic. It's very standard Tom Waits, combining the Captain Beefhearty psycho blues with old-time jazzy crooner music and a nice dash of Bob Dylan-esque singer-songwriter stuff as well. This album is loaded with highlights like Chicago, Face to the Highway, Back in the Crowd, the title track, Satisfied, and honestly, really the entire album stands out. It looks like a dirty hobo in the camp, it smells like cheap cigarettes and spilled bourbon in a dive bar at 12:30 a.m., and it tastes like mulligan stew made the old-fashioned way.
It's a fantastic album, and the only reason it's not higher up on the list is that every album Tom Waits has done after Swordfish Trombones is kind of the same, There are unique differences from album to album, but they're all kind of the same. And Bad As Me really adds nothing new to the Tom Waits canon, so that's why it's only number 5. Still a great album, though.
So number 4 is Jacksick, Fripp, and Collins, A Scarcity of Miracles.
Unlike most of the albums on this list, I remember hearing about this when it came out. And I remember thinking, that's a weird little thing. I'll get around to that eventually when I've listened to all the King Crimson studio albums. And so I didn't hear it until this year. But I'm very upset that I missed it now. But by the same token, you have to understand, when this came out, we didn't know what it was. It was just kind of a weird little thing on the side Fripp had put out, and unless you were a devotee of Fripp, which I was not at the time, you probably didn't pick it up. Nowadays, though, now that Jacksick, Fripp, and Collins have gone on to become the nucleus of the current version of King Crimson that reformed in 2013, it's pretty apparent what this is, which is a King Crimson album by any other names. This would be as though King Crimson had actually gone ahead and released Discipline under the name Discipline, and then had decided that they were King Crimson after all, and then released Beat and 3 of a Perfect Pair using the actual band name. But anyway, the music here is About what you'd expect from Fripp collaborating with Mel Collins again. It's very much the Fripp ambient soundscapes meets the kind of smooth Euro third stream fusion that the Islands Band did. Jacko is he adds something here that I'm not always really able to quantify. Like, I get the idea that we probably have Jacko to thank for the fact that this album is made up of actual songs, as opposed to just long, drony saxophony bits. But on the other hand, I'm not always so sure that the songs he put together are necessarily the best. I don't know. I like the album a lot. It's my number 4 for the year. It's an album I'll keep listening to in the future. But the vocals can be a little bit of an Achilles heel. I like Jacko. I don't hate him the way a lot of King Crimson fans seem to. But I will give you, he has a very sort of generic modern prog singer voice. And at times it starts reminding me a little too much of like Ray Wilson on the Calling All Stations Genesis album, but this is so much better than that. It's an album you should definitely hear if you're a King Crimson fan, and it's an album that you should hear if you're a fan of prog albums or progressive-ish albums released this decade.
So number 3 is the Beach Boys, The Smile Sessions.
Now, I'll be the first to admit, this one is kind of cheating, but it was one of my favorite albums released in 2011, so... The Smile Sessions is basically taking the raw components of an unfinished concept album that was abandoned 44 years previously, and reshaping it and ultimately making some attempt to give it the form that it might have had if it had actually seen the light of day in 1967. The Smile Story is one of the classic rock and roll legends. Brian Wilson tries to beat the Beatles, winds up creating an album that is so monumental and so ambitious that it drives him into a deep and profound mental breakdown that he arguably has never recovered from even to this day, 52 years later. An album that is so sprawling, so dense, and so out there in terms of what it was trying to accomplish that arguably the studio technology to fully realize it didn't even exist at the time. Brian had already revisited the album once in the early 2000s, and this album is structured pretty much along those lines, trying to make sense of the chaotic murk that was the studio tapes for the original 1967 album that never was. And I've gotta say, while it's rough around the edges in a way that the finished album almost certainly would not have been, this still makes for a pretty solid listen, even though as a hardcore Beach Boys fan, it did wind up being a little underwhelming because honestly, when you listen to it, you realize that the band pretty much mined all the best tracks for their early 70s albums. So if you're familiar with their 68 to 73 stuff, you've probably heard most of these tracks before. But even so, what was left, what we hadn't heard before, or at least those of us who weren't super into the bootlegging scene, is fantastic. From something as weird and insubstantial as I'm in Great Shape, to the version of Surf's Up they made by cobbling together a solo piano version and the finished 1971 track, to the otherworldly threateningness of the Elements' Fire, which Brian Wilson is apparently afraid of to this day. And which he wrote after experiencing a bad trip where he saw himself burning in the fires of hell. Now, as I said earlier, this is kind of a your mileage may vary because so much of this had seen the light of day, either on the sort of butchered, half-assed album they put out instead of Smile in '67, or on one of their late 60s, early 70s albums that, you know, I could definitely see you being disappointed by it or being like, why did you put this on here when there are a million better albums? But honestly, I just enjoyed it. But anyway.
And so my second favorite album of 2011 is St. Vincent's Strange Mercy. St. Vincent is one of my favorite songwriters of the last decade or so, and Strange Mercy has a very strong claim to being the finest collection of songs ever assembled by Annie Clark. From the angular, post-punky guitar workout of opener Chloe in the Afternoon, to fantastic pieces of guitar pop like Northern Lights and celestial chunks of bittersweet indie like the title track, Year of the Tiger and Dilettante, Strange Mercy took everything that the preceding St. Vincent album, Actor, did and streamlined it, adapting the more orchestral and baroque pop stylings of that 2009 release to a much more stripped-down, guitar-centric approach, and I think it pays off in a huge way, producing an album that is not just one of my favorite records of 2011, but one of my favorite albums of the entire decade, and a record that will almost certainly pop up again when I do a best of list for the decade as a whole some point in the next year or two. So my number one album of 2011 is Fleet Foxes' Helplessness Blues. I've been a fan of Fleet Foxes' brand of indie folk ever since I first picked up their debut on a whim a while back, mostly because I thought the album cover looked really, really cool.
Helplessness Blues improves on absolutely everything about the debut, and in some ways it's the best Fleet Foxes album. The cool chamber pop elements are still there, but the song structures are much more distinct and much more spread out. You don't just have cool single type tracks, there's a lot of long, interesting multi-part tracks like Bitter Dancer,
just as the sand made everything round, just as the tar seeps up from the ground,
or the 3-part 8-minute epic, The Shrine / An Argument, which starts off this cool folksy bit before eventually winding up in this really cool sounding Captain Beefheart-esque free jazz moment. I could just go on and on and on, and I would, but the video would be like 10 minutes longer and I would wind up talking about every song on the album, and this would just balloon into a Fleet Foxes review, so I won't. Suffice to say, Helplessness Blues is one of my favorite albums of the 2010s, it's my album of the year for 2011, and maybe it'll show up on the sort of decade end best of list I'm probably going to wind up making sometime next year, but we'll talk a little bit more of that when I get to the best albums of 2017. But anyway, so that was my list. There was a lot of great albums that I did not get to or that I did not listen to quite enough to make it onto the list. Like I know there's a PJ Harvey album that is beloved. There's some hip hop that's supposedly very, very good that I just couldn't get to in time to be making this video. And it's just 2011 is a really interesting year in hindsight, and I'm going to talk a little bit more next time, which will either be 2012 or 2013. I may skip 2012 for the moment because I can do 2013 right now and I can't do 2012 at the moment. But something I'll talk about in one of those videos is the idea of a graveyard year, of this sort of the graveyard phase of a decade, because 2011 is definitely that. It's whatever was popular in 2011 doesn't really reflect what the decade as a whole wound up being, and so it's just a weird little extension of the 2000s that you get. And so that was kind of a confusing end to the video, but yeah, so I will see you guys later with hopefully another review. I'm going to be covering Coil's beloved 2005 album, The Grape of Maples, which I have taken great joy in mispronouncing every time I mention it. But until then, I will see you guys later.